So, good afternoon. Thank you for joining this TDL webinar on the subject of the evolving role of CISOs. We're about to start. This session will be recorded and will be made available in the next couple of days, along with a summary report. Any questions you have, put them in the chat. There's Q&A or the chat, and they will be funneled to Steve, our moderator, who will then bring them up for discussion, providing they are appropriate, as always. So without further ado, thank you for coming, and I'll hand over to Steve, who will take us from there and introduce the panel.
Yes, thank you very much, David, and a warm welcome from my side. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're connecting from. So I think we have a very interesting panel today. The subject is something that actually appeals to me a lot, having been a CISO for many years. So what is the role of the CISO, and if it is evolving, how is it evolving? And I think we have three excellent security professionals to help us in this discussion, to help us understand what's going on at the moment. I will let them introduce themselves as part of the way we move through this webinar. But I think that we have very mixed backgrounds, which should help us, I think, to have a wide-ranging debate. So, as usual, I'll take the webinar in the same way as we normally do. I'll give a short introduction to the subject myself, very briefly, and then I shall try to talk as little as possible and let the guests talk. And to make their points, I will just ask questions every now and again. And as David said, there'll be room for questions at the end. So some remarks on my side. The first one is, does there actually exist a standard job description for the CISO? This was a question I can remember being discussed at a Gartner conference, I think, in the 1990s already, although it wasn't the title CISO, it was security manager. And already then, it was not clear. So I looked up on the web to try to find some references, what people are saying about the job, largely unexpected, I think. So some public sector responses, Gov UK, for instance, describes a chief information security officer as creating an environment and culture in the organization that ensures the security of its information technology. That's fine. That's pretty much how I would sort of look at it. Cybergov.Australia actually goes a bit further. Because it says that the role of the chief information security officer within an organization should extend to both information technology and operational technology. And as one of our guests today has operational technology experience, that's something I will be coming back to him about. But it gives a whole list of things that the CISO should be doing. And just the list itself shows you just how wide and how encompassing the job is. So providing cybersecurity leadership, overseeing the cybersecurity program, coordinating cybersecurity reporting, overseeing incident response, business continuity, vision and strategy, working with suppliers, and the list goes on. So I think the public sector is quite coherent in the way it looks at CISOs. How does the private sector think about the role? I think one of the interesting sources of information I used in preparing for today was a Splunk study on the Chief Information Security Officer, last updated February 2025, and they come up with a similar sort of definition. So senior executive responsible for developing and implementing an information security program with a similar set, if you like, of responsibilities, which is good. Cisco makes the interesting comment, and I think this is very true, and one of the things we will probably discuss today, that the exact responsibilities will vary by organization. My own feeling on this, and through discussions I've had with several actors throughout the years in various from various backgrounds, I think this is quite so. I think the actual role varies enormously, not only according to sector, but also according to size of company and to some extent to company culture, I think. But again, the kind of things that CISO lists as being classic responsibilities are pretty much what you would already expect. Then I came across an IBM article, The Evolution of the CISO, How the Role Has Changed. And that too made a couple of interesting observations. So one of them is that in recent years, the CISO role has taken another significant shift. And in the face of increasing cyber attacks and the growing risks of business disruption, the thought is that they are moving from a technical role to more of a business leader. Again, we'll see from our colleagues if this is true. I suspect this is more from US sources, but it may also be true in Europe. And this is one of the things I'll be interested to hear from our guests. Couple of statistics before I hand over to the people who are really going to debate this. So the Splunk CISO report, 84% of board respondents claim CISOs meet their expectations. So this is very good, obviously. This means that things are working as they should do. However, the same report says that CISOs overrate their relationships with boards in specific key areas. 53% of CISOs say that their responsibilities and expectations have become more difficult. However, boards continue to have high hopes for CISOs. And again, there's this idea that they will develop into better business leaders. 21% of CISOs, and this is very interesting, have been pressured not to report a compliance issue, apparently. I'll repeat that. So 21% have been pressured not to report a compliance issue. And 64% of boards believe that positioning security as a business enabler was the best way of asking for additional budget. There's also the Night Dragon report, also 2025, covering 100 plus Fortune 500 CISOs, where over 80% of CISOs feel that they are supported by the CEO and the board. So again, this is very comforting news. We can see that the relationship between the CISO and the board is a good one in general. However, this report points out there's a negative effect on mental health. So this is the idea of burnout, which has been discussed extensively in the media over the last year or two. And the figures they cite are 37.4% of CISOs have this on an occasional basis, 18 frequently, and 15 often. So that's quite a large number of people who are reporting on negative effects on health. And then 65% of CISOs expect more of a leadership role in the coming year. And then finally, Hendrik and Struggles 2023, covering 262 CISOs around the world, say that 30% of CISOs say that they currently sit on a company board. So this is very good. They actually sit on the board. 40%, however, report that there's no succession plan for the CISO. And again, this doesn't surprise me. I think it's unfortunate, but succession planning, etc., is something that, in talking to people, I feel is not well done on the whole. Over 50% believe their board only somewhat or does not have the knowledge or expertise to respond to their presentations. And 80% of the respondents agree that they are given good support in leadership and development. So I'm going to end there. Lots of stats and lots of points of view. And I'm going to ask my guests to intervene in alphabetical order. So I'm going to start with Philipp Amann, who is CISO at Austrian Post. Hi, Philipp. Please introduce yourself and give us your point of view.
Thank you, Steve. So, welcome also from my side. Thanks for having me. Philipp Amann, I joined Austrian Post as their Group Chief Information Security Officer about 2 years ago. So that's my current role. And before that, I spent most of my career working for international organizations or EU agencies, in the area of combating cybercrime, cybersecurity, intelligence management, so different roles. So really now experiencing, both sides of the coin, as it were, especially, looking at my previous role where we also had the opportunity to, provide input to legislation and regulation like NIS2 and DORA. It's quite interesting now to be on the other side and having to implement those regulations. What you just described, I think it just, reflects the current very sort of complex and heterogeneous environment that organizations face that, then by proxy, chief information security officers face. I think it really is a role that requires many different hats, as it were, or has many different dimensions. Just looking at my current role, I think it's very operational. That was a bit of a surprise for me. But, I think to your point, where should the role be positioned in an organization? I think that very much depends on the industry. I think it's quite interesting to see in sort of, the the current industry I'm in, there's a tendency to keep the CISO role reporting to the CIO, maybe having a dotted line to the board. And I think that's for two main reasons. One, I think you really need to understand the business, especially if in our case, OT is actually our core business. So, the core business of our organization is OT. So, and then obviously a lot of IT, we have about 700 different applications that we develop in-house. So, and just, our IT department, if you will, that's about 700 people. So that's, even though we're a postal organization, we do some serious software development. And I think that means you need to have a very good and deep understanding of how the business works. And I think that's one way of achieving that, instead of just being somewhere in another sort of linked or in another part of the organization in risk management arena, whatever it is, and then just giving sort of orders to IT. And I think the other reason why I think you see those changes as well, and my CIO recently reported from one of the meetings he had with his peers, is that many organizations in the past have changed that. They've actually put now the CISO under the CIO, and NIS2 is apparently one of the main reasons for that, or any kind of similar regulation. Because simply put, if you're a board member and your organization has to be NIS2 compliant, which applies to postal services, obviously we have to be NIS2 compliant. We also have a bank, so we also need to comply to DORA, and many other EU regulations. But that also means you either have a situation where you talk to the CIO and the CISO, and then they look at each other, and maybe finger point and blame each other. So it simplifies things, I think, from a board view, to say, what, I'm going to put that role under you, and then have one person to speak to, one person that has the responsibility.
I don't normally interrupt it, but I will ask you one question there, because classically, of course, the objection to this has been that the CIO then wears two hats, i.e. he is or she is responsible for keeping the systems running, but now they're also responsible for securing them. Has that caused any problems, or do you think that's okay?
So in my instance, I think it's worked quite well. I think I'm lucky in the sense that our board is very much security aware. I think they're very much aware of their roles, their responsibilities. I think they're also aware of the fact that cyber attack, any kind of cyber attack, is one of the major risks that we face as an organization, because simply we don't have a backup system. B, if we go down, there is no backup organization that can provide services that any postal services offers, for that matter, which I think really highlights, even though we're not a, what's the difference? We're not a critical, we're not important. What's the differentiation under NIS2? It's important.
Essential and important.
Yeah, exactly. So, but still, if you think about it, if we go, if our systems, if there's an outage, that affects everyone else, and there's no other organization that can jump in. So I think that's I think there is at board level, there is that realization. And one of the key statements that I heard from my CIO and our board is, whatever we do in order to become NIS2 compliant, we would have done anyway. So I think so I'm lucky, I suppose, in the sense that I have a board and senior management that is very much aware of the needs. Yeah. Having said that, I think we need to be very much we need to defend our investments, which are quite large. And obviously, whatever euro we spend, will reduce our profits. So we also need to have the right KPIs and tell the right stories, and be, sure. I think you mentioned that, Steve. Demonstrate how what we do actually supports our business and makes it more secure.
I'm going to stop you here, sorry, because there'll be plenty of time to go into this in detail. So you raised a couple of good points. Just before passing over to Guy, I will just explain to our American audience that NIS2 is a European regulation concentrating essentially on critical infrastructure and resilience. So you'll probably hear this term a lot during the debate. So Guy, please give us your take on this.
Thank you, Steve. My background is a bit diverse, I should say. I was for a long time the European CISO for Sony Electronics, a Japanese company based out of Belgium, and later on I was the global CISO for Sony Electronics based out of Singapore. And at that time, one is we were not subject to so many regulations, but we were a target by a number of bad guys. So we had to do with activists, we had to do with Chinese, North Korean, and everything. So, and we had, as a company, had a few big incidents. So it's a very different way to appreciate the risk if you have been a target. So when I started, we were 2 people. Before I left Sony in 2020, we were about 160 in security. But we had to protect 50,000 PCs. We had, 100 factories. We had, a lot of R&D and so on. So the problem was, and at that time, all security operations were in one department, where there was very little security in IT. Later on, that was shifted back to IT. So it is a kind of, so the scale of the problem is changing in a sense. And because of the incidents, we had more resources. And because of the incidents, there was an awareness of the management that things can happen. It was not so theoretical. We wanted to prevent it. So that's one thing. When I quit, later on, I set up my own company, and I have been advising a number of public sector actors, essentially. I was supporting the biggest retail bank in Luxembourg for a while. I worked, like Philipp, I supported the post and telecom operation in Luxembourg, reorganizing their CRO function.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, I dealt with municipalities, with railway infrastructure security, with at the present mainly with the central medical data management, and so forth. So I think the coming back to the question of the day, one is the size of the company makes a big difference, and the resulting size of the security team. Yeah. That makes a big difference. When you're a small company, the CISO will do lots of technical jobs, everything in some sense. Yeah. Sometimes I have a debate because some people say, well, is it your job to do everything, or is it your job to make sure everything's done? It's a kind of debate whether you go one way or another. I think we shouldn't, worry too much. When you look at other functions, there's a bit of debate. What is a CTO? Okay, we can talk about it. It's not so precise either. What is the responsibility of a COO? Also not so very clear. And even when you go more classical functions, you have the CFO is reasonably precise, but there's also diversity out there. And even when you look at HR functions, HR can be many things. Yeah. So it depends on the company and their history. I think we'll see that evolve in a big way. And I've seen also boards which have different compositions and different, specialists in the board or more generalists in the board. It changes totally the dynamic. At the end of the day, when you're starting a job like we were talking about, you have to decide where are you going to lobby for? What is the right role or right scope of the security person? I certainly believe that it has to be, there's a risk has shifted through NIS2, through DORA, more to the what they call in DORA and in NIS2 the management body. The management body being could be the board, could be the executive team. I think the CISO has to get used to talk at their level, or interact and influence a lobby, the same as he has to deal more with the business. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the bread and butter is still very much, technical in many ways. Yeah, all of us have to manage our vulnerabilities. All of us have to manage our multi-malware things, and so forth. And all of us are chasing inventory every day. Yeah. So I think that is a big evolution. I am certainly of the opinion that in general, the CISO should be separated from the CIO side. But I totally conceive it depends on persons. Yeah, it's a general statement, but the reality is it case by case.
Okay, listen, let's perhaps wrap up there. Thank you very much, Guy. That's a good set of introductory comments. Move over to Johan. So Johan, please, if you could introduce yourself and again, give us your take on the position.
Yes, thanks, Steve, and thanks for having me in this session. Yeah, so I think I have been security officer for more than 15 years now in different sectors. Before that, I was just a subject matter expert, with doing a lot of operational activities. And I think that is my takeaway now, that in all these years as a security officer, I've seen myself grow as a operational subject matter expert person that is, let's say, guided to do all kinds of things, into eventually a strategic advisor to the board, and thinking along with security goals and objectives based on the threats and risks that you also have to advise them. It is a broader scope with all things that you have to take into consideration. So yeah, it is a very dynamic area. Actually, I'm more used to the term privacy and security officer or chief privacy security officer, because also that area is also now under the scope. Yeah. With let's say the general data protection regulation as initiator. So CISO, yeah, it's, for me, it's just a role. It's also about the person. It's especially about if this person is knowledgeable with the right competence. I think we will talk about that later, about the skill set. Yeah. Because that's very important. Do you have the right skill set? And I think in the end, if a real big incident, a cyber incident occurs, then you know what you're made of. With that, the thing, the pain, the thing in your stomach that hurts, and that you have to do, and you have to respond and recover. Yeah, then it's important if you are really having the right competences to guide this together with the others and the crisis team. Yeah, I think that is my first
Okay, very good. So listen, thanks. I think you've all brought out some very interesting points, and obviously you all have experience in the role. Let me ask you a bit of a provocative question. Do you consider the CISO as a genuine C-level function, in the sense that a CFO is or a CEO is? Because you've been or are active CISOs, do you believe you get the same level of authority and respect within the enterprise, or do you think this is less so for a CISO? Anyone can open up.
Maybe I can start, because I am positioned under the COO, actually, because he is responsible for the IT and OT assets.
Right.
But I periodically report to the CEO. And depending on the agenda and in those occasions, I'm sitting also in the board meeting. But I'm not part of the board. No. Yes, I'm more part of the, let's say, the management team of operations.
Right. But the fact you have contact to the board is obviously a good thing. Yeah. So it's going in the right direction, at least, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm more used to the governance model that the COO is responsible, and I'm advising him as responsible to protect the IT/OT assets.
Yeah.
And also advise the accountable person of the company on risk and compliance issues. But on threats, I advise the COO in this case.
So this is actually going in the direction of the Splunk report, which was pretty much saying that CISOs are expected more and more to have a wider range of functions and to develop into business managers in the general sense of the term. I don't know, Philipp, Guy, any thoughts on this? Is this something you see happening? Are we there already, or how do you see this evolving?
I think it depends a bit about we talk about size, that's certainly an aspect. It depends also, what you have to protect or what is exposed.
Very true.
The risk related to those items will be a bigger thing. When I work in the banking sector, obviously, they had the European side, Frankfurt, on their back all the time for risk management. There was I had to deal with risk committees, with financial risk, non-financial risk, operational risk. So there was a whole risk culture. Sometimes in other companies we operate like an individual somewhere. In the postal services, in telecom, they had created, because these days, while we focus on security or cybersecurity and the risk related to that, but there are many more risks appearing left or right. So that's why they had created the chief risk officer function to a little bit bundle things together. It's like you said, should you be on the board, whatever, or should it be through the risk officer or any risk committee? What kind of you have to put sometimes things together to.
But I think my feeling is a bit like yours. Sorry to interrupt you there. My feeling is a bit like yours, that over the years, having been involved in this type of role over 15 years, at least when I was doing it, it was all about risk mitigation, essentially. Whereas the observation is that it's becoming a role which is not only about risk mitigation, but about business enablement. And I think Philipp touched on this because, you made some very good points, that you have to understand the business. You really have to add value in some senses. So do you feel this shift, Philipp? A lot of what you said seems to be indicating that the role is shifting in that direction, I think.
Yeah, I think again, probably it's quite clear that there's no sort of general answer to that. I think it really depends on the, like he said, on the industry and also the size of the organization. I think the maturity level. I think it was either Johan said, well, the smaller the organization, the more likely you are involved in the nitty-gritty and the technical details. I think, not too long, a few weeks ago, I spoke to Rob Wainwright, who's now obviously with UBS, and obviously that's a very, very strategic role. So I don't expect him to get involved into how do we design our network segmentation concept and things like that. So I think it very much depends on the size of the organization, the size of the security team, and the maturity of the organization. And I think, and then I will say it's the industry, and I think it's quite interesting to even for our own organization. So we have a number of subsidiaries within the EU and outside the EU. We have our own bank. Now, for regulatory reasons, we have a dedicated CISO role with the bank, and they have to be independent as such as well. So if you look at any financial institution versus a sort of industry organization or a company like Austrian Post that produces things or has very strong focus on production. Typically in a bank, there's actually legislation, regulation that clearly tells you where you have to place your CISO. Whereas where I was coming from is that, and you see the trend there, that you have especially organizations that have where OT and IT, the production element is at the core of the business.
Right.
There's a tendency to have sort of I would say a more or less strategic CISO role, depending on the size of the organization, but really sort of a mix, somebody who has a vision, has a strategy, but also understands the business. And I think that's also important because, and I'll just add this because we're probably also talking about the future and what are the new challenges. Frankly, one of the biggest challenges I see is technical debt, and how do we deal with, the legacy systems, and how do we, instead of just focusing on AI and the next great thing, how do we deal with those, 400 applications that need to be fixed, and then how do we get the budget for that? But that also
Nothing new there, of course.
exactly, and again, I think that requires you to have a deep understanding, and also be connected to the development teams, to IT. Have those skills also to speak those different languages. But again, I think it's very hard to just direct that. Basically going to telling the CIO, you now have to remove your technical debt. I think that's going to be harder. Whereas, if you're part of the organization of the IT department, that is.
Okay, that's good. Let me challenge you all. I mean, you've all said pretty much the same thing, and I must admit, I agree with you 100%. So it's clear that, if you want to find these sort of fully fledged CISO functions, which are largely political roles, demanding very specific skill sets, which we'll get to in a minute, you're mainly in larger companies, etc. Whereas if you go to very small companies, I think it's unlikely, because companies of 10 to 50 people maybe not be able to afford a CISO. So where is the cutoff point, do you think? Indeed, is there one? But do you agree there's this sort of gradual evolution from small companies to large ones, and in smaller companies, it's mainly technical roles that are they're being sold as CISOs? And I'll add one thing here, and I'll be interested in your comments. I sometimes have the feeling when reading recruitment ads that companies are selling positions on the basis of this very nice sounding CISO title, whereas when you look at it, it's effectively a security engineer title. So any thoughts on that?
May I respond to that?
Yeah.
I don't think you should judge on the amount of persons working. I think it's about of the assets that you have to protect. I think that is a very important thing to take into consideration. Indeed, it's also about the persons, from an organizational level, but it's also about the scope of the assets that you have to protect. That you have to decide, which type of person or persons you should put in.
Right.
And so it's not only thinking about, okay, it's a role, a combined role, as a CISO role, but it's also the focus on what do you have to protect, and what do you have to take into your organization to deal with that. Just a small side note, but my father-in-law has a small company, a feeding company with 4 factories, 60 people, lots of lorry drivers, but also engineers, working in the factory, and also having a small group of office people.
Okay.
Based on my the decision and advice in the family, he decided to get a security person because of the amount of attacks, and that he say, okay, this is something that is a real specialized area, that we need a special person for this, and not having someone that does besides his normal job. We need a professional. So
that's a good point. So let's move on then, and let's think about this. So let's go back to the idea of the traditional CISO. I would like to discuss with you now exactly what skill sets do you think are required to be a CISO. What I can tell you is that the ICS2 study, which was recently published on the skill shortage problem, said that, interestingly enough, the skills that were most valued by recruiters were things like problem-solving abilities, collaboration skills, and willingness to learn, which again makes a lot of sense from my side. But then again, I think one of you at least pointed out, and I think this is very true, it is, of course, a very specialized role, and you still have to understand the technology. I mean, after all, the role is to some extent to make technological risks understandable to the business managers. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on this? What skills do you think we should be looking for when recruiting CISOs?
Well, I mean, interestingly enough, for coming back to your job recruiting example, I noticed there are 3 types of job posting. One is the beginners. They use like very short description, yeah. Then those who learn that security is a bit more complicated, they try to put 3 pages of requirements. And then those who made it beyond that, they make it on a page and something like that. So it's it is evolving. And I think it depends also. I mean, you once said about the number of assets. It depends also what is your budget, in some sense. There's a belief that in some sense you should do everything. I think that's unrealistic. If you need a hardcore network security assessment, maybe you should find someone who can do that for you in a good way. Don't try to do it by yourself.
Fair enough.
And so forth. I think, but I think that's why I said before, you have to educate your environment. You have to lobby in your environment for your number of assets and your type of problem. I've been working with some companies who didn't know what the sensitive information was. I worked for others who had only sensitive information. Obviously your question is a little bit.
But let me give you the following point of view, and I may be completely wrong here, but I admit to making the statement several times, and that's that sometimes when talking about CISOs, I would say you don't find many 17-year-old generals. What do I mean by that? I mean that it seems to me that, at least in its fully fledged version, it is a job that requires a lot of maturity, a lot of experience, and I would say almost equal measure of soft skills and technical skills. And I think this is very difficult when you have this sort of, these posts which are being advertised as CISOs, which are demanding just purely technical skills and in which very young people can move into. And these I personally don't so much consider as CISO roles, to be quite honest. So my thesis is that this is really something which I think you ought to evolve into over several years, but I'm willing to be proved wrong. Philipp, I'm going to pick on you because you actually worked also in public and private sectors, and maybe there's something we can learn from that. What do you think about this?
No, I think when it comes to the skill set of CISOs, I think I certainly agree. I think sort of experience is a relevant part, but I think you certainly need to have that mix of technical skills, willingness to learn. I think that's something I very much like, in the sense of trying to be on top of things. You don't have to go into again the nitty-gritty and the details of new and upcoming technologies, but I think having that sort of oversight and a foresight function, I think that's certainly important. But at the same time, I think collaboration skills, communication, soft skills, I think are equally important, because I think especially if you find yourself in that space between the board and so more technical people, software development teams, IT, OT operators, I think you need to be able to translate and speak those different languages and create those bridges. I think that's a key skill. Yeah. Maybe that's something that comes with experience. Might be harder to have.
I also think I would put it as follows. I think it's similar to what you're saying, that it seems to me that you need to understand the technology to the point that you can make the decision you need to make, but not further. So you don't need to be an expert in all the nitty-gritty details, as you say. But Johan, because you work in fact, also in a very OT-IT mixed environment, do you think CISOs should be doing technical tasks, or do you think really they should be operating much more at the strategic level? Or do you also think it really very much depends on where you
are? I think in general, the CISO nowadays should be more working up into the strategic level and being a kind of a lobbyist to get the budget done, because in that way you can do things. And with good stakeholder management and indeed saying the right things with the right language, you get their commitment. That is the role I see as a CISO more in general. But personally, I like to build bridges between the 3 levels. And personally, I like staying involved in the operation and knowing what's happening, because I came from there. So I'm more used to that. And still today I'm talking about the logs for security monitoring and how we can make it tied to the use cases. I like to talk about that, so that in the end if someone debates from, there's a very famous saying, Johan, why do you worry so much? It will not happen to us. And then I can really give the facts and really give the right information, you know, that is more concrete than just assuming things will not happen. So I like to talk about those things as well.
I think it's an essential skill. I mean, if you were to ask me personally, what I would put first on the list of skills for a CISO, it would be communication. Because I think, you know, these days, as you mentioned yourself, I think, you know, we have the GDPR, which involves privacy elements. You have legal elements coming in and regulatory elements through the different policy initiatives in the EU. So you're really dealing with a whole sort of, how should I put it, a whole range of different people with different backgrounds. And I think it's really essential to be able to communicate between them quite well. But here's an interesting thing. One of the things I've read about the CISO post recently, and it's come up in a couple of places, is that there seems to be a feeling developing that sometimes CISOs are being used a little bit of as scapegoats. That if something goes wrong, then all fingers are pointed at the CISO as having ultimate responsibility for risk. Whereas I would say, for instance, the CISO is much like you said, you know, a sort of facilitator, a chef d'orchestre, and the people who should be shouldering the risks are probably more the business managers. And the role of the CISO is more to support them and advise them. So has anyone come across this kind of idea? Do you think this is a developing trend, or is it not a problem?
I think if you have a serious incident, you are clearly in the first line, real time, all the time. Later on, when the incident fades away, you have to do more. You do a lot more work on the preventive side. You have to educate and so on. Yeah, I think that's very different. I would like to add also something to the communication side. It's I learned that you have to communicate face to face as much as possible to all the business leaders as much as you can. So I had a global role, so I traveled 600,000 kilometers per year because I cannot just send an email to a managing director in Brazil and expect him to do things. I had to go there. I had to organize regional security meetings and so on, yeah, to be as close as possible to where the action was happening. I went to India every 3 months for 10 years just to be there, to make sure that everybody is working in the same direction. So that's one. Communication as much as possible, face to face, explain, lobby, persist. That's one thing. The other direction is I needed to have at least a medium-term plan. You know, I needed data, so I needed to build analytics platforms, because when you have many assets, you know, it's not just about judgment. You really need real-time data if you can, but it's built in you need 1 or 2 or 3 years to build that. So I think you know, having, even though you need a strategic view, or what's the strategy you're going to follow, what's a game plan you're going to play, so that you know, despite every day there's new things happening, but you still have to structurally improve things. So communication and strategic thinking, and as much as possible, provide yourself with the means to have numbers as much as you can.
I agree. I mean, as I said, this is the #1 soft skill that I would at least put on the top of the list. But the question was actually whether the CISO should be ultimately responsible for risk. I agree they should be on the front line. I agree they should be supporting the business managers. But I think it's very hard for a CISO to be ultimately responsible for risk, because they only have part of the picture. You know, they have the IT, OT side, but they don't have all the business side typically. Or maybe this is what is happening when we see that CISOs are evolving into, you know, business managers. So yeah, and this brings me to something else, because there's a lot of discussion about this on the internet at the moment. There's also a lot of discussion about pressure on CISOs and burnout, and apparently it's a real problem in the industry. So again, you know, do you feel this? Do you feel it's a problem, and how do you think it is in the sector? Is it being over-exaggerated, under-exaggerated? Do you think it's something we have to keep a careful eye on? Anyone can answer.
Steve, before the answer, I'm just pointing out there's a question in the chat.
Well, maybe answer if anyone would like to answer that. Otherwise, I shall pick up on the chat question.
I would like to answer because it's indeed, and especially in the Netherlands, is a big thing, and also a big discussion about that. But I think that is the consequence of the evolution that too many things is now in scope and having to deal with that because of the expectation of the CISO role, and also again not the right skills for that role. A lot of people are now going into this area because of the big
Glory.
attention. Sorry?
The glory.
The glory, the
Nice.
money, you know, it's a hype, it's a big model, it's a big big thing now as cybersecurity. I say there are also a lot of free riders. I call them free riders. People are doing these things but are not really the right type of persons. Yeah, they will go into this area and then they will see, oh, wait a minute, this is a lot of things that we have to do. And if you're not having the right skills, then these consequences will be there. It's real serious attention.
And as you speak, it makes me think almost that it's not only skills. I think to a certain extent it's personality, because there is definitely a lot of stress associated with the job. I mean, we've all done it on this panel, so I think we all know that it involves quite a high degree of stress. So I think you need to be prepared for this. It's going to happen sooner or later in the position. I don't know if Guy or Philipp would like to comment on this. Otherwise, I'll pass to the question from the audience.
Two quick ones. One is, many risks CISO is dealing with are not his own risk, but I think his responsibility is to explain, bring them up, persist in getting them solved. It may sometimes take a long time, but you have to be part of the risk solving problem. Yeah, maybe you're bringing them up because that's your risk manager, and maybe sometimes you bring up more painful topics. That's one. The burnout things come when, of course, there's an inequation between what you have to do and the resources you have. That's one thing. The second thing is, when you have an incident, it can be very taxing, and not just one day, but there is no more day and night. It's a 24/7 for a while.
Right.
But it's a limited period. But I think it depends a bit on the personality.
Yeah.
But you have to learn. If you are the main risk manager, you have to learn how to communicate, how to bring it up, how to lobby for solutions. Yeah, at the end you're a change manager, and you have to bring solutions, even though it takes a long time.
Hey, listen, I'm going to have to, sorry, Guy, I'm going to have to move on to the last question because it's a good one. And I'm going to ask, I'm going to give Philipp at least the opportunity to respond first, because he may have had some questions here. So the question is as follows. Regulations like NIS2 are covering all risk, which means that other aspects like physical security, personnel supplies are in scope. If you have a CISO that's below a CIO, who is in charge of fulfillment then? And what is the respective roles? And I would add an observation from myself, right throughout my career in various organizations I work for, I found quite often a weak point was job descriptions. They were often out of date. They were often allowed to lapse, and it wasn't clear quite often who was responsible for what. So I don't know, Philipp, if you'd like to take it, or if you'd like to.
No, I think that's a really good one, because I think it really exemplifies how you interpret and then implement regulation, particularly EU regulation.
Yeah.
Well, I will agree that there are some physical security elements in NIS2. At its core, it's a cybersecurity regulation. And I'm saying this because, we are a very heterogeneous organization. We have 6 subsidiaries that also within the EU that also have to be compliant with NIS2. We have to be compliant with NIS2. So the first question we ask ourselves, first of all, why are we within NIS2? Because of parcels and courier services. So anything outside that for us is not NIS2 relevant. Second, we see it at its core as a cybersecurity regulation. Meaning, if we look at OT, will I look at spare part management? No, of course. You could argue, well, if I don't have these spare parts for my sorter, it's not going to work. So that could still lead to an outage. But what we said, and we had this legally challenged internal and external, we came up with a NIS2 scoping statement, and we said this is what we're going to do as Austrian Postal Services. We're going to secure all digital services that we need to deliver a letter from A or parcel from A to B. If you can pay for that or not, we don't care. Which means then in practical terms, SAP for us is not part of our NIS2 scope. Of course, we're going to secure it. So I think that's where you need to be very careful not to have a very pragmatic approach. And I think that's the difference between, and I can say this, writing a policy and having to implement it. Because if we saw we have 28,000 employees. We have 800 applications. We have about 400 different domains. If we start to, make everything NIS2 compliant, and then on top of that, make sure that the services that we provide to our banks are also DORA compliant, that will kill us. So I think that's why we need to be very pragmatic, and that's what we did. The regulators might say, well, hang on, this is too, the scope that you've defined is too narrow. But then we can always expand. But it's better, I think, too small. Have a methodological, like a method that is legally challenged, that is sound, that says this is a risk-based approach to securing those services and applications that we need to to deliver letters and parcels and be NIS2 compliant. So I think for us, yes, we have business continuity management. We're even certified for that, and of course we have the link to our CSO. So we have a Chief Service Security Officer. But for us, really, NIS2 is a cybersecurity regulation. And I think that's
by definition, because NIS1 was the first cybersecurity regulation. And this is a follow-up.
Exactly. And
but
I think,
Philipp, if I may, I'm going to summarize, because you said two great things, which I really liked. One is you used the word pragmatic, which I think is super, absolutely key to the role of the CISO. But you also said, and I think this is really interesting, that there is an enormous amount of difference between having a policy and implementing it. And I think this is really true. And I think these two things alone summarize a lot of the issues that we see in the CISO community. But I would like to move on, and maybe I give Johan a chance to comment on this. I think the more general question is, do regulations such as NIS2 challenge our internal governance structures? Are roles and responsibilities clear, or do you see any confusion now?
No, I think it will give more clarity who's responsible for what. So as long as you make that due to regulation, you initiate the right governance structure with the right ratio metrics, with the responsible process owners as risk owners, and so forth, and so on. Then with the right control framework based on regulation, but also based on standards that you apply to your environment and your assets. In our case, we don't have. We also have IEC 62443 requirements in our control framework, and then the right responsible owners are, as the first line of defense, they are the one that has to deal with them and to implement them.
Yeah, and I like this
and we set the policy.
Yeah, I like this reference to the Iraqi matrices. I think these are very useful. Not used enough, if you ask me, because I mean they bring very clear. They make things very clear if you use them correctly, I think so. But look, I'm going to move on again because we only have 5 minutes left, and I'm going to start with Guy and then ask each of you to answer my last question, which is perhaps the most interesting for those people joining us today as an audience. So, Guy, what advice would you give to CISOs of large or medium organizations, and why?
Okay. Okay, well, I only repeat myself. I think it's important that, the question is, are you new to the organization? That's one. Maybe you just joined. Maybe you were promoted inside the organization, you will have an understanding already, which is very different. If you're very new to the organization, you have to spend as much time as possible to understand how a company works, because there are many unwritten things, many decisions, many criteria, many values, which you're supporting the business, but the business means many things. So spend as much time as possible to understand the business and to crystallize step by step the business risk and the risk related to your area. That's one thing.
Perfect.
The second.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
The second thing is, as much as possible, develop over time at least a strategy. When your organization is bigger, you can't take 90-degree turns. You can't, anymore. You have to plan ahead of time. And one of the things you have to plan ahead of time is, I'm a very big promoter of analytics. You need numbers to run security more and more, because there are so many things you have to follow. Judgment is good, but the numbers are better. But to get those numbers, you have to put an effort. It's not easy, because the numbers are all over the place.
I'm going to have to stop you there, Guy. You've already given 2 good points, but otherwise we won't have enough time for the others. So thank you for that.
Sure.
I'll move to Johan, and then finally I'll take Philipp. What is your advice, Johan?
First of all, I agree fully with Guy to understand the business and to really see that, not only hearing it, but see and feel it. Additionally, perform a thorough threat assessment and get to know your threat landscape in order to know what to do and to really classify your risk, because you have to know that. If you don't know your threat and your threat actors, then it's very difficult to pay attention on what to protect and how to mitigate it.
Very good. Okay, thank you. Philipp, it's interesting because Guy actually echoed one of your opening statements on knowing the business, etc. So I hope we haven't stole your fire here, but what would your advice be?
No, I think that's, fully subscribe to what has been said. I think if I can just add to that, instead of repeating what has been said, I think in addition to that, I think it's very important to understand the strategy and vision of the organization. So where do you want to be? Where is the organization going? We're now moving from a sort of national organization with subsidiaries to a clearly international, global organization, which changes the perspective, changes my responsibilities. And I think in addition to that, in addition to understanding the business, knowing your stakeholders, understanding the what's the threat landscape, what's your security posture, all those things, I think that all makes sense and it's important. But I think equally you need to understand what is expected from me. You could ask a question, in 2 years from now, what I could ask this question to my boards, like in 2 years from now, what has to be different, in my area. What do you expect from me? I think where are we going as an organization? I think that's probably another dimension to consider.
Excellent. And I'm going to add one of my own, because this last statement prompts me to share it. I think one of the lessons I learned far too late in life as a manager was that I was, in the earlier part of my career, far too prescriptive, and I didn't use my team or the organization enough. So my advice to young managers would be, even if you know the answer, give your team the problem and not the solution. For 2 reasons. One, it gives them a sense of ownership. So whatever comes back, they will feel like they're the owners of it. And secondly, my teams always really surprised me with the kind of innovative ideas that they came up with. So even though my idea might have worked, it was much better opening up the problem for others. And I think this is difficult to do when you're under pressure and you're operating as a CISO, short times, and you see a solution. Having the sort of confidence to open it up and let other people solve it for you can be rather difficult. So you'll excuse me for ending on the last note, as it were, but we're bang on time. I think that was a great discussion. I would really like to thank all 3 of you. I think you all made excellent points, and I really hope that those people who dialed in thought it was worthwhile and learned something interesting. And I will now pass over to David for the very last word.
All right. Thank you very much, Steve. Great job moderating, as always. And thank you to Guy, Johan, and Philipp for contributing to a really interesting discussion on a subject which I have a strong personal interest in, and I'm sure many other people do too. So with that, thanks again. The session was recorded and the recording will be made available in the next couple of days. And our next webinar will be on the 12th of June on the evolution of computing. And we're only going to spend an hour talking about that, which will be an achievement in itself. Anyway, thank you so much and have a great evening and good weekend.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.